All right, let's take a look at some pivot table structures. Now, you may or may not use pivot tables, but that doesn't matter. The whole goal is for you to understand what the real value of a pivot table is. So we're going to open up a file, go to File, Open, and we're going to go to Browse, and we're going to come down and choose a file called Pivot1. So here's Pivot1. It's basically a sports database that has salespeople, dates, months, products that are sold, and the region they were sold in, the year, purchaser, and the profit associated with that. There's just some basic sales data to use in our pivot table. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create several pivot tables, and we're going to look at it from a different perspectives. Because a lot of people have asked me in the past, they're saying, well, that's all great that you understand pivot tables, but we've never done a pivot table before. How would we create one from scratch? And so that's what we're going to do next. Let's start with just a simple pivot table. So you click in the middle of your table somewhere. We're going to create a pivot table from this. So you go to Insert, choose the word Pivot Table, and it circles the data. If it doesn't circle the data, then you haven't got it correctly. You got to be inside the table when you do it. Say OK, and that creates my pivot table. So these fields that you see in front of you here are actually the columns from the table. So you got sales rep, date, and month. These are the columns up on top. So the data is represented in the pivot table by each column of data. Now what we're going to do is we're going to compare two different columns together to come up with results. So let's choose our month column and drag that month down into the rows drop box. Got these little drop boxes below here. We're going to take the sales column and drag that into the values drop box, and take the product column and drag that into the columns drop box. And that creates a pivot table comparing the products by month. Go ahead and put those in those drop boxes, and let's zoom in a little bit so you can see this a little bit better. And you see that this number here represents the concentration of sales for March for baseballs. And this one here is footballs, and here is gloves. So we're going to start with this information. I'm assuming everybody has what I have on the screen. It's important that you get your hands on and do this. So essentially, look at this information from a marketing perspective. Now, if I was going to do a marketing campaign for baseballs, what month would be the best month to do the marketing campaign in? Of course, December is sort of a given. We're going to do some December marketing. But if we're going to do some marketing up in the upper part of the year, which month would be the better month to do it in? So it looks like that March has like a little concentration of sales here. And so if we actually did our marketing campaign in August, I wonder what my success rate would be. Probably not real good, because people are buying at that time of year. If I did it in April, I might miss an opportunity to do some marketing. So definitely March is probably the best approach, or somehow prepare it in February and kick it off in March, so that when people start buying, we have our marketing campaign kind of in place. So I hope everybody sees this. This is a concentration of where we would do that. Now let's take a look at basketballs. Let's figure out the best time to market basketballs would be. To do that, I'm going to come over to the sales sheet. So I'm looking for basketballs, and so it looks like we have basketballs in February, it looks like. Let me see. There's basketballs in May. I'm actually trying to make a point. Did I make my point?
Yes, you did.
It's a little easier in the pivot table, isn't it? So the reality, if you're trying to find some information, the pivot table doesn't make it harder. It actually makes it easier to understand the data. So in this case, it looks like we have something occurring in this range. I don't know, we might do it in this range somewhere along here, maybe up here, maybe down here, I'm not sure, or maybe somewhere in the middle. Now let's look at our exercise machines. Something occurred in May. Some concentration of cells occurred in May. Now, I don't really know what the answer of why that occurred, but I see that something happened in May. Now, I have two conclusions. One conclusion could be called this New Year's resolution. So people make a New Year's resolution to lose weight, and it takes them 4 months to realize, I'm never going to lose weight. So what do? They go buy an exercise machine. That's one theory. Another theory could be a summer thing. Maybe they're getting themselves in fit for summer. I don't know. I've come to that conclusion because of where the data fell. So I'm going to make some calls to some customers and find out if these are possible scenarios. Come to find that the summer thing seems to be the most predominant. Now that I know that the summer thing is the most predominant, can you tell me what the ad is going to say? Get ready for summer, right? So you see, we can actually come to conclusions based on the data layout, the information that we're looking here. What if my exercise meet occurred in November? What would be my conclusion? Would I have the same conclusion? Or would I have a different set of conclusions? Maybe it's a winter thing. Maybe they can't go outside, so they're stuck indoors. So they go buy exercise machine for that reason. You see, so you can draw conclusions from the database based on what you see. So it looks like that gloves and golfing, I'm not sure if gloves have to do with golfing or not, but there seems to be a concentration of cells at the beginning of the year. And I slide back to the back and I noticed that tennis, according to the data, seems to be a late year type of sport. So if we were doing a marketing campaign in January, it probably would miss the mark because people don't seem to be interested at that point. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. So we can name this sheet one, call it marketing. And that could be our marketing conclusion. Now, as we build more pivot tables and look at data, if we want to go back and look at it from a marketing perspective, we would come back to our marketing pivot table, and we don't have to recreate it. We already have it available to us. Let's come back to the cell sheet and let's create another pivot table. So we're going to click in the middle of the data area, insert, pivot table, choose the default settings. Now this time we're going to create something to monitor our employees or our salespeople. So let me see. I think I'm going to put my sales rep in the columns, my product in the rows, and the cells and the values. Okay, so I'll put the sales rep in the column, the product in the rows, and the cells in the values area. Let me zoom in a little bit on that to see that. So what I'm looking for is I'm looking for where there seems to be an interest or a concentration of cells. So it's very obvious to me that Alice is very interested in golfing. Obviously, when she goes out to a sports store, she's not focused on anything else. I see that Ernest has some skills in baseballs, and Frank does, and they all seem to have a little expertise in their areas. The problem is they're not cross-selling. I'd like Alice to start selling some of these products, but maybe she doesn't understand them. So I'm going to create a sales team together, and I'm going to have Alice give us a little presentation on golfing. We want to know who she sells to, what she sells. We want to know what her strategy is. What are the seasons? She knows all this information. She sells this stuff on a regular basis. I'm going to have Ernest and Frank team up and give us a little presentation on baseballs. What are the seasons? When are the buying seasons? When should we start preparing? When should we start stocking the sports stores? We're going to look at that. So I'm going to have each one give a little presentation on that. And eventually what I want to do is hopefully I'm going to see these areas populating a little bit more. As they start understanding the other product line, that they can actually start selling those other products. Now, I think it's pretty obvious to me where Alice's expertise is, correct? But let's look at Fred's expertise. So if I come over to this sheet and look for Fred, here's Fred here, Fred Edwards. And let me see, Fred's down here somewhere too. There's Fred Edwards there. Looks like Fred Edwards has sold some footballs and some rowing machines, but it's still not real clear that I've found all the Freds. So again, can you do it this way? Absolutely, you can do it this way. But if you use a pivot table, it makes it much clearer as to who is doing what. You're not making it harder, you're making it easier to understand the data. And so the goal is, once you get the vision that what pivot tables can be used for, then you're going to have a better understanding of how to make it work for you. And so that's essentially what we talk about pivot tables, that's what it's all about. Now you don't just wake up one night and think, I think I'm going to create a pivot table. It doesn't quite work that way. You have to have a reason to build a pivot table, and you have to have some goals of what you're trying to look for. I'm looking for some results. And so I'm going to give you an idea, and then you're going to tell me how to create the pivot table, and we're looking for some information. You come over to the cell sheet. This gives you a chance to put your mind to it to say, can I create a pivot table from scratch? Now, the question I have for you is this field here called region. Well, say I'm a corporate manager, and I want to find out what's going on in my regions. I not only want to know what regions are doing better and which ones are doing bad, but I want to know why. And I'm going to use a pivot table to find out why. That's my goal. So we're going to look at the create a pivot table based on region, but then we want to compare that with some other field. And that's where you have to come up with the answer. So let's go ahead and create our pivot table. Insert, pivot table. So these are your fields. Now, I need you to tell me what to do. We're going to use the region field, but where do you want me to put that? In the columns or the rows?
I would say rows.
Okay, the region's going to go in the rows. It makes no difference. You can switch it out later if it doesn't work. Okay, then we're going to compare that with what?
Sales.
Okay, well, sales is going to go in the values area. But then product, want to do product? Let's do product?
Yeah, let's do product. Shannon said product.
Goes in the column. Okay, what does this tell us? This tells us that it looks like that to me, the total, these seem to be the higher revenue regions, right?
Yes.
The higher ones there, okay? But what products are they selling that other regions are not selling?
Stepper machines.
So we've got some exercise machines here. We've got some stepper machines. There's two there. So there's a lot of exercise stuff going on here. See that?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why, but I just noticed that that seems to be a deficiency in those areas. So I want to find out why. So I'm going to call and ask them why. Maybe there's a reason. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that maybe the reason is they just don't have a marketing strategy. So I'm going to go to the northern areas and I'm going to ask them, how do they market these products? And I'm going to take that marketing campaign and give
Hi,
it to
Ruth.
the poor regions, you see? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually stamp that information. Now, I came to that conclusion because I can see these deficiencies in here. See that? See that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm looking for. So now let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's open up our field list. Let's take out the product. So click on the product here. Now let's compare it with a different field. Pick a field, any field. If it's wrong, we'll swap it out and put something else in. Any thoughts or?
Let's do sales rep.
Okay, sales rep. Sales rep goes in there. And I wonder if it would look better if it was flipped around. Let me take the region, put it in the columns, and drag the sales rep in the rows. Oh, there I can see a little bit better, see it? So you can just move this stuff around, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, so it says that these are our bigger regions here, and it looks like to me that Alice is working in the Northeast region, Ernest is working in the South. Looks like they're very region dependent, aren't they? Very little sales are occurring outside of the region. The only one that's this one here where she has gone to both South regions. But they're very dependent upon their region. Well, this is good and bad. So maybe what we need to do is think about ways that we can cross over regions. So Alice, we mentioned, was very good in golfing stuff. So maybe we can use her as a resource that if any of these people have some golfing opportunities, they can turn them over to Alice, and Alice can close the deal. So by crossing over regions a little bit, maybe that they're too territory oriented. And so if we have a method that allows them to go outside of their territories, that might be one way to go about that. So I can see that's one little problem I see is they're so territory oriented, right? So that could be a problem. Let's take the sales rep out. Let's compare it by, I don't know, month is probably a good one to try. Let's try the month. All right, so what does that tell me about? Do you see anything here that looks unusual to you about these sales habits? What is this? Does anybody understand this?
Seasonal, maybe?
What's going on there? Why are there so many blanks in here? See that?
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a seasonal thing.
Maybe it's a seasonal thing. I know. I understand the Southwest. That's pretty obvious. Because when surf is up, sales are down. Because everybody's out surfing, right? I don't know, but this concerns me a little bit in these areas, right? Some of these. So I have some questions I need to ask. Now, maybe the problem is they lost their salesperson. They didn't have the salesperson. So the question is, how do they get new salespeople? Well, again, I want to turn back to the northern people to find out what they're doing to keep and maintaining their salespeople. What agency are you going through? Maybe they're going through a specific agency. And maybe we can give that information over to the other regions so they can have a better hiring campaign and they can hire things a little quicker. So the idea of that is these are ways we can cross over. So we came up with a lot of questions right now based on the way we laid it out. There's no right or wrong way. It's just throwing stuff in and out until we see it. Now I can also click on the year function and drag it into the rows area. So that's going to break it out by year and month. So it's a little bit different layout. There's still a lot of blanks in here. Year 2005. And it filled out a little bit in here, but not too much more. But there's still a lot of blanks in all these areas. So I just don't understand why they're not selling things during those months. So these are questions that I'm generating that I'm going to be asking. How am I going to generate those questions? By looking at the data and try to come to some conclusion as a result of this information. That's what a pivot table is. So I'm trying to get you to understand the value of a pivot table. So at this point, you could create a pivot table based on your data. You can simply drag some fields in. So say, for example, you get some information where you're trying to look for some data. Don't tell anybody you're doing it. Just go create a pivot table and see what happens. If you can't find anything, then nobody knew. But if you find something that looks really interesting or understanding, then maybe you ought to share it. So the idea is that having some basic knowledge that a pivot table could be a solution and it could provide some opportunities for you. Let's come back over to the marketing sheet here. And now what I want to do is I'm going to look at a pivot table from the pivot table perspective. What tools are available in the pivot tables? So we talked about the first chapter section talks about understanding the pivot table. And then we're going to get into filters, formatting, pivot chart, adjustments and layout, and formulas and functions. So this is how I sort of broke out the pivot table discussion. Is first we're going to focus on what you can do to filter, why you would want to filter a pivot table, and then we'll get into the formatting techniques. And so we'll focus in on those specific topics. So I broke them out into about 5 different topics. So we're going to go to our pivot table, and in this case, it's going to look at filtering feature. So this talks about the filtering capability, talking about clearing the filter. It's talking about filter labels, and there's just a bunch of topics in here, slicers. Let's come back to the marketing pivot table and let's look at our filters. So on the filters, you click those little drop-down arrows. Now we're all familiar with these filters, so it's just a matter of using them. So essentially, you can filter this pivot table out. If you want to look at just first quarter, you can click on January, February, March. Say OK, and it filters it down to this quarter. If you clear that out, if I want to look at specific sports or specific subjects here, I can click that and say I want to use baseballs, basketballs, footballs, and maybe tennis balls. So I can filter it down to that specific group because I want to analyze stuff in that area. I don't want all the other stuff. So I'm going to focus on this. So yeah, you can use your filter tools to filter information out. I'm going to clear that filter. So now we're going to create a slicer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the numbers on the far left side, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and I'm going to insert some rows above this. So I just want to create some blank lines above my pivot table. And now we're going to create what's called a slicer. And I'm going to create what's called a slicer report. So you click on your pivot table, make sure you have some blank lines in the top, go to your Analyze tab, and there's an option called Insert Slicer. Now this pivot table is based on products and months, so I can slice it in a different way. So maybe I want to slice it by sales rep, and then maybe by region. So I'll create a sales rep and a region slicer so I can cross-filter it or cross-sort. So there is my filter. There's another filter. I'm going to shrink these filters up so they fit right above the pivot table. So this is what I call a slicer report. So now if I want to click on the central, it filters it down just the central area. So you can create a chart like this. Since it expands up and down, it's not going to expand upward, it only expands downward. Then you can actually go through and select these slicers, which is sort of a modern day filter is all it is. It's just a quicker way to filter. But the value of this is we can cross filter this way. If you clear out the filters, you can clear them out completely, or you can select on just the northern regions and you can slice that out. Now, if I want to slice just certain sales reps, I use my control key and click on those sales reps. I can clear it out here. So this is called a slicer report. Now we're also going to create what's called a chart. Click in your pivot table, go to the Analyze ribbon tab. There's a thing here called Pivot Chart. So the pivot chart then is based on the pivot table. Say OK. I'm going to size it down a little bit and plug it in right to the side over here. So I have a chart. Now when I filter it, the chart is going to change and reflect the results of the pivot table. Just like these here, see how the chart is changing. There's my northern area there, and it shows me the chart results of just the northern area. If I want to see just central, I can see it that way, or just southeast. If I slide down a little more, I can do southwest. But the idea is that I can filter this out and see the chart. So that is how, and the chart is no different than a chart that we just created. It happens to be a pivot chart. So if we clicked on that chart, you can see that the ribbons up on top here are all related to the charting capabilities. So you can use all of your chart styles and all that stuff. So that is basically a chart. This is a slicer. This is a chart. And this is sort of a table I could use to filter this information quickly. So again, if you are moving around a lot and changing a lot of stuff, you can create something like this to help you out. Look in the pivot table. Now the next section we're going to talk about is formatting. Let me slide down a little bit more. A lot of stuff in gray areas. Here's your pivot table format. And so we're going to go through and show you some of the pivot chart styles, style options, and all the formatting tools, and all the things you can do with formatting. And you can go back and look through the book if you'd like. Click on the pivot table. Go to the Design tab. And here's the thing called Pivot Chart Table Styles. I can change it out to some color coding style. I can also add what's called banded rows or banded columns. So if I want to add a banded row, it puts it in. Now some of the different formats actually look different from the bands. Let me show you a different one here. Let's try that one. Let's try some of these down here. Let's try this one. If I turn on my banded row, see it looks a little bit, you can see some different ones than that. There's one here. So these on top, see, have these full color bands. See it? So, like I said, different chart layouts provide different types of banding capability. There's your band charts. So that's something you do with format. You can also highlight anything you want, go to your Home tab, and use any of these formatting tools. So if I want to highlight certain things, I can highlight certain fields. Maybe I'll turn that to be black. So I can see that. Maybe I want to highlight specific things I want to monitor or watch. And so I might want to take this one and highlight that one. So that's the idea, is you can go through and use any of the forms. So I don't really need to cover any of the format capabilities because you pretty much know them. It's just basically what's available to us. Now select this data area in the middle. Not the totals, just the data area, not the grand totals. And we're going to apply some conditional formatting to this. Let's say, for example, we want to highlight anything that's greater than, I would say 3,000. So you come up to your Home ribbon tab, go to Conditional Formatting, highlight Sales Rules, and choose this greater than option. Now what you're going to do is you're going to go here and you're going to put in $3,000. Anything greater than $3,000 you want to highlight. So this will allow you to have a large pivot table to have certain things sort of jump out at you if you want to highlight specific items. So if I say it was greater than, I put in 3,000 in here. Looks like it has turned red. I can turn it to some other color if I wanted to. Now that's just highlighting those values. And so that's essentially how formatting is all about. That's really all there is with formatting. There's really nothing more than that other than just highlighting certain things based on some standard tools that we've been using in the class. Now we've already talked about the charting piece. So in the course where we talk about conditional formatting, that's one option we can use. There's a lot of stuff in gray areas. If you really are into pivot tables, there's a lot of information in this courseware way beyond what you would probably normally want. And the reason why is because I teach a class out of Ireland. They've been using pivot tables for quite some time, and I have one class I teach called Advanced Pivot Table class. And the people that come to the class are experienced pivot table users, and they have specific problems, okay, that they're trying to resolve. And usually that's the case. And so I've had to really study up on it to be ready for that. And they've actually taught me some pretty interesting things, some questions they came up with that I didn't know existed, or that certain things would occur when you do various things. And so I've provided all that information in here. This thing preserved formatting, auto-fit features. There's a lot of high-level capabilities in here. But if you focus on the white areas, those are the core things you need to know. But there's definitely a lot more in this course. Okay, a lot of gray areas. Here's our pivot chart section. Where we pivot chart, it's simply just tied to the pivot table. Then you modify it as if it's a normal chart. Now we're going to talk about pivot table alignment and layout and arrangements. So this is an important section because this is where you really can make the pivot table work hard for you. Let's go back to our pivot table. Okay, so we're talking about layout and arrangement. One problem we have is these balls on top. See, I've got baseballs, basketballs, exercise machines, and they're kind of in the wrong order. I kind of want to keep all my ball sports kind of together. So if you right-click on one like this, come down to where it says move, and I can move the footballs to the beginning of the list. If I slide out to the right here and choose my tennis balls, right-click on tennis balls, and click on move, and move that to the beginning. So now I have my tennis balls, footballs, basketballs, and baseballs all together. Now the exercise machines, I want to move that back to the end. So right-click on exercise machines and move that one to the end of the list. Okay, so now I've got my ball sports kind of together, my golfing together, and all my exercises are together. So it's a little bit better organized. And a lot of people don't realize that once you get a pivot table, it gives you a default layout. You can move these things around. I don't know if I would want to do that down here because these months are in the order that I want them to be in. Now we're going to talk about grouping. So now I want to take these things and see these as a group. So I can select my tennis balls, footballs, basketballs, and baseballs. If you don't have them all together, just select a few that you have there. Highlight the labels. Go to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, and there's an option called Group Selection. So you click on that item called Group. That created a group out of that. I'm going to call that group ball sports. I'm going to select my gloves and golf balls, group that together, call this golfing. And I'm going to slide in the back here and choose my rowing machines, stepper machines, and exercise machines, and group that together. Oops, something went wrong. Let's put those. Exercise. So what I've basically done is I've sort of organized my things through these tabs. Now I have 3 tabs basically. Whoops, kind of messed that one up a little bit, but that's fine. I didn't select them all, looks like. But you can see how you can actually have these baseballs, the ball sports could be all grouped together as a group. And these summary values are the summarization of the group. So maybe what you're going to do is you're going to have your salespeople into teams. The teams have nothing to do with the database. It just means how you organize them. So you can group people together. Group Alice and Ernest and Fred together as one team. And make sure that team has sort of a cross-section of skills so they can kind of rely on each other to help each other out. And that's kind of the idea of why you would want to group these together. You can create these groups. So you're organizing your pivot table to be more functional, more summarization, and organize it in the way you want to see it. Now, the one problem that I've run into with pivot tables, and people tell me, this is great stuff. I can see these numbers, and these numbers are highlighted by the conditional formatting and all this. But the problem is I don't know what this number represents. So if I look at that number and I'm thinking, well, let's take this number right here. It's 2070. What does that number mean? I mean, what records made up that number? But let's say, for example, that in February we did 2017, but in March we did maybe 20,000. And you're going, wait a minute, how come? What happened in March? And so you want to see the numbers associated with that. There is a way to do this. If you take any number you see in front of you and double click on that number, it actually zooms in on it, gives you a summarization of the actual record that made up that particular number. So these 2 numbers here added together came up with that number we just zoomed in on. And so you have access to every single record at your fingertips. As you make changes to stuff and you dive into it, you want to see who actually made that sell, who actually was involved in that, or how many records made up that number. Or maybe, like you said, one month it was 10,000 and next month was 20. And you're going, wait a minute, was this one person that purchased it, or is it a bunch of people? So is it one big sell or what? So the idea of that is you can actually double click on any one of these numbers that seem suspicious to you. Click on that and you can see what made up that number. So this happened in July, and it was by these salespeople, 2 different regions. So you can look at that. So the pivot table is a very powerful tool, and you can reorganize it in a lot of different ways. But there are some specific tools that allow you to do that to make it much clearer, much more understandable. That's what we're trying to do with a pivot table. That is kind of the goal of the pivot table. So it's just a matter of diving into it and seeing what you can do. And in the book, I go through the core concepts of what you need to know about for that particular concept. Now, the next one I want to talk about has to do with, this deals with formulas and value field settings, they call it. So it's called formulas and value field settings. So what that simply means is that if you would right-click on any number in front of you, come onto this option called value field settings. This is going to tell you the math operation that was used to generate this number. Let's say we want to count number here. I want to count the number of records. I don't want the sum of the records. This means that there's a total of 3 records here that made up that number. And there's a total of 2 on this one. So you can see that there's just a lot of ones out here. Maybe that's where you want to look at how many transactions did it require to come up with that number. If you right-click it again to go to your value field settings, you can switch it out to averages, max, mins, products, and there's just a ton of other standard deviations and various other things you can switch this out to. So the value field settings is one of those. Let me switch it back over to the sum function. This is where it was before, the sum. All right, now we're going to look at it from a formula perspective. Now, if I come out to the cell sheet here, I can create a formula and add that formula to the pivot table. But the problem is, if you add a formula, you have to come back and add it. So we're going to show you combine a couple things together in a minute. First, I'm going to show you the problem that gets created by creating a formula in the data sheet and the fact that it doesn't get updated in your pivot table automatically. And then we're going to show you how to do that automatically. So if I come over here and I call this, I'll say adjusted ADJ cells. So this is where I went a little bit too quick before. So we're going to create equals. We're going to take the cells value times 2. I'm just going to create a simple little formula that's going to multiply the cells and come up with this new field called adjusted cells. And then we're going to return, and then we'll do a fill handle and fill that down. Then we're going to go back and use that field in our pivot table. Okay, so make sure everybody's got that all right. Here, there's my value, my adjusted cells value. So everybody should have some sort of adjusted cells here. Go back to the marketing table, and we're going to go to our field list. So I'll click on my little button here. It says my field list. Now you notice that the adjusted cells is not listed here. And that's because the way we created the pivot table, that it actually is not included as part of this. So in order to get that adjusted cells into the pivot table, we have to come up to where it says change data source. So everybody can see where I'm going here. If I change the data source, see, it does not include that as part of the data source. So this is the problem you have when you add fields into the data sheet. So you have to actually redefine the database and include that new area in there. And therefore, that adjusted cells is not part of it. Now you can go through and add a field in from the data sheet, or you can go through and add the field from within the pivot table. So what we want to do now is we're going to come up to our fields, items, and sets, and click on this thing called the calculated field. Now this is not a formula. This is not your standard formula that we're going to be creating right now. Because what we're going to be creating, a calculated field, is a calculated field based on a comparison between 2 other fields. So it's a little bit different than your normal formula type capability. Because when we use it, we're going to put it in there as what's called a calculated field. We're going to call this, I'll call this a new profit. And that's going to include the profit, which is profit right there. And we're going to divide that by 2. So we're going to create a little formula and build that right into the pivot table. So the value of this is that when I get new data into my database, I wipe out all the formulas that are in my database. But if I do it here, I'm doing this inside the pivot table. And so we can actually create a formula inside the pivot table. And that's the value of understanding this. I had somebody at one time that came to me and said that she had all these formulas in the pivot table, but she had absolutely no idea where they came from. And her engineers were creating all these formulas, and she wants to go look at the source of that field to find out what the formula is doing. And she couldn't find it. And I showed her where this was. Then she knew then that you can create your own formulas at that point. So sometimes you might not only from an understanding, maybe you just need to know that this capability is there in case somebody creates this. So when I do this, I'm going to add this to my formula, and now I have a new field here called new profit. And when I say OK, in my fields, I have a new one called new profit. So knowing that you can do that, okay? Now let me show you a better way to make all this work. We're kind of making this and trashing this one up pretty bad. Let's go back to the sales sheet. Now, we talked about it earlier about creating tables. And I said a table was a better way to go to provide input into a pivot table. And when you do an import, a lot of times that will create a table automatically. So you don't even realize it's happening. But let's convert this particular sheet or range to a table. So we're going to click anywhere in the middle here. And this kind of integrates us back to the previous sections that we talked about. I always like to bring other subjects back into it to show how these things integrate. Insert, table, and say OK. So now we have a table. And then what we do now is we create a pivot table from the table, and everything is going to be automatic at that point. So you click on this, and there's an option right in the menus up here somewhere called Summarize with a Pivot Table. So click on this Summarize with a Pivot Table. It looks like it circled the data, but it didn't actually select the data, by the way. It actually defined the table. And the table name is called Table 3. That name appeared right in the corner. So the pivot table is not looking at the data. It's looking at the table name. The table name defines the data. So I can sit there and create a few fields, drag a few of these a month field, and maybe a product goes on top, just like we did earlier. But this pivot table is based on the table, correct? So now, if you come over to the sales sheet, and you add a field out here, remember I told you to expand the table? This is where the automatic feature comes into place. So this is where I went a little bit fast for Shannon, but I was going to create a field out here, if you remember that. So I'll call this new, I'll call it my new, whatever we're going to do here. And I can say equals profit times 2. So we're just going to create a simple formula, and the formula is going to look different in a table structure. So you hit the Enter key, that creates that new field. You can even come to the bottom down here and add Jeff Hutch and actually add additional fields down here. And that gets automatically added to the table. Let's come over to our pivot table. Now you notice that those fields are not located in here anymore, right? They're still not there. But if you come up to your table here, and there's an option called refresh. So what do you think is going to happen when I refresh this information? It's going to pull it all in. So essentially, all you need to do is when you create a table, your data into a table layout, it's more automatic. It actually just updates automatically. So when you create a chart from a table, again, when you add things to that table, the chart gets updated automatically. Because the chart is not based on the data, it's based on the table name. The table name defines the data. So it's like a subset going into it. This is kind of an important little point, kind of a crossover point to kind of bring tables back into it, to show you the difference between a range and a table. A table makes it much more automatic. Where a range, you always have to come back and redefine the data every time you make a change to it. So it depends on which way you want to go, but I wanted to bring this back into the subject because we wanted to be able to show you how to use a table as input to a pivot table or a chart. So if I refresh it right now, there's my new year, comes in right there, my new data. And the Jeff data is in here somewhere. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. I had a company out in Elko, Nevada. It was a mining company. And they have these big trucks. This was a maintenance crew. They had these huge trucks that would carry their rocks out. And the problem is that if the trucks were broken down or out of service, they were losing money, basically. But their management wouldn't let them increase their inventory of their parts, or spare parts. So they had this dilemma. So they came to me and they asked me, says, is there a way we can do a pivot table to look at our data to find out where the failure points occur? And so we were able to structure the pivot table around and show them a way that could see which parts seem to fail the most often. Once they identified those parts, they used that information as ammunition to get their inventory adjusted. Now, maybe they need to go buy a new part, a more expensive part that's not going to break down. Maybe they need to increase their inventory so that those trucks are never out of service. But they've now identified the areas of major failure. And they can actually prove that they can save money by actually increasing their inventory. So that's the idea of this whole subject, is trying to understand what. And that's one example of many examples that people have used pivot tables for, to try to understand their data better. And so you can think about your data source that you're using and think about if it's an inventory type database, then maybe you're going to look at ways to see where the inventory levels are or when the stocking levels need to be replaced. Maybe you're using a pivot table to look at some information in terms of overall sales information or accounting information. What companies seem to always typically be late in their paying their invoices? So that may provide an action for you, is to start sending those invoices out a little sooner because they seem to always be late. So you would understand those customers better, and maybe you need to do some more quick follow-up on them because they seem to get lost in their system. So by identifying those areas of weaknesses that you might be able to improve on. And so you can look at it from lots of different ways, but again, you're looking for some specific information. You're looking for an end result, and you're trying to throw different fields in there to try to get them to look a certain way, a certain layout.